Hi folks, in today's lesson, before we get into photosynthesis, I want to go over a couple things that are important to understand because these are topics that support photosynthesis. So we're going to start with light, and this is a little mini physics lesson. Light occurs in waves. So when we're talking about a wave in physics, that's what we mean, right? This is what a wave looks like. And you'll hear the term wavelength show up a lot, wavelength. Wavelength is the distance between crests or peaks in a wave, and it's abbreviated using the Greek letter lambda that you see right here. So when we're talking about wavelength, we're talking about, is the wave a long meandering wave like this, or is it a short jumpy wave like that, right? So wavelength and energy of the wave are actually inversely proportional, right? The shorter the wavelength, the more energy you have, right? This long meandering wave is going slowly. This short wave right here is going much more quickly. You've got a lot more energy in this wave than you have in this wave. Visible light occurs along this electromagnetic spectrum that you see here, and you'll notice that visible light is a very, very narrow window in that spectrum. The wavelengths of light go between 400 and 700-ish nanometers. And by the way, wavelength is measured in nanometers for our purposes. In physics, you may hear it referred to as angstroms, which is a different measurement. So this is what we mean when we talk about visible light. So here are gamma rays, here are X-rays. UV light occurs right here on the opposite side of the violet part of the spectrum, and then infrared light right here occurs on the red side of the spectrum. That makes sense, right? And you may have seen the Roy G. Biv, right, of rainbows, which is how we write out the order of the colors of the rainbow, which is really the order of the spectrum, because that's what you're seeing when you're seeing a rainbow. But this is actually the reverse. This is the longest wavelength in red and the shortest in violet. So it's actually the reverse of the way. The red would be here and the violet would be here, so it's reverse of how you see it written out when we write out the colors of the rainbow. All right, so the red wavelengths are the longest wavelengths. They have the least energy. The violet wavelengths are the shortest, and they have the most energy. The other thing that's important to know is that when light waves arrive someplace, there are three possibilities of what can happen to them. So I've drawn a little leaf here. You can have light hitting a leaf and it being absorbed, right? If it's absorbed, it stays right here in the leaf. A second possibility is that light strikes the surface of the leaf and is reflected. Okay? Now there is a third possibility we don't usually talk about in photosynthesis, and that is that light is transmitted. In other words, it goes through the object that it's striking. For our purposes, we're really just focusing on absorption and reflection of light. So when we see a color, we see what makes it back to our eye, right? When light is absorbed, it stays right here. When it's reflected, it bounces off of the object and back into our eye. So if a leaf is green, we're seeing just the green portion of the spectrum hitting our eye after bouncing off of the surface of the object, which means green light is reflected by leaves, right? The other wavelengths are absorbed for the most part, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But overall, that's what that means when we talk about objects having a color. What we mean is which wavelengths of light are reflected back into our eye that we can see. All right, now, what's important to know is that photosynthesis works because of pigments absorbing light. Okay, so pigments actually absorb light, and you know these guys, right? Chlorophyll. You've been talking about these since baby bio, right? So, excuse me. photosynthesis works on light that is absorbed, right? Which means possibly the worst color for growing plants would be in the green area of the spectrum of light, right? Because that's light that's being reflected back. Photosynthesis is working on absorbed, not reflected light. However, notice this little chart that you see at the bottom here is a measurement of the absorption spectrum of these pigments. Okay, so chlorophyll A, right, which is a blue-green color, this is showing you that it absorbs in this particular range really well, and then you get a dip, and it doesn't absorb very well, and then it's got another peak here in this range, right? Chlorophyll B, which is a yellow-green pigment, absorbs really well a little further down the spectrum. Then it's got this dead zone, and then it's got a small peak down here. There are what we call accessory pigments, right? Accessory pigments. Accessory pigments are pigments that are not primarily used. Plants use chlorophyll A primarily for photosynthesis. They also use chlorophyll B for photosynthesis, right here. And then sometimes they'll use these accessory pigments. Now notice the accessory pigment, the carotenoids, and this is actually a category of pigments that includes yellow pigments, orange pigments. There are xanthophylls that are other colors and so on. But notice, if you just had chlorophyll A, notice you'd only be using this portion of the way of the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, and this portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. By adding in accessory pigments, notice now you're using from here to here, right? And you're using some down on this end of the visible light spectrum. So what's happening is you're narrowing the dead space by using some accessory pigments for absorption. So in addition to chlorophyll, plants will have these other pigments to kind of help broaden the range of absorption of light, since what they really want is to use that absorbed light to do photosynthesis. All right, something else to talk about is the structure of a leaf. And this is important because this is the plant organ that's going to do most of photosynthesis, right? So it's important to kind of understand that. And again, what we've done here in this picture is we've taken our leaf, right? So here's a little leaf. We've taken it and I've chopped it. Cut right across. And then what we're doing is we're lifting this up and looking at the cut side magnified, and that's what you see here. When we say cross section, that's what we mean. We cut across the leaf, right? And we're looking at the cut side now under a microscope. And you're used to thinking of leaves as being flat, but really notice that leaves actually have a bunch of empty space inside of them. You know, you've got these areas full of holes in here. It's not full of cells necessarily. So you may remember from baby bio that there's a bunch of parts to the leaf, right? The outside of the leaf, both on top and underneath, is covered by what we call a cuticle. This is a waxy surface that prevents water loss. Just underneath the cuticle is an area called the epidermis, and again, that's on the upper and lower surface of the leaf. These are protective layers. And notice that both epidermises are clear. Okay, so when light strikes the leaf, light comes down, strikes our leaf, it actually is transmitted through the cuticle and the epidermis. And then it's going to hit this next layer of cells called the palisade. Okay, so the palisade, notice these cells are green. And notice how closely packed together they are. These are cells that do the majority of photosynthesis in the leaf. They're full of chloroplast. Most of the light gets absorbed here in these palisade mesophyll cells. And if any light did manage to kind of sneak through, it would strike the cells that are in the spongy mesophyll, or the spongy layer of the leaf. And notice this whole thing in the middle is called mesophyll. The cells in here are mesophyll, which really meso means middle, phyll means leaf. Embedded within the spongy mesophyll are the veins, and the veins and you can see that there. The vein contains two kinds of tissues, xylem and phloem. And these are tubular tissues that carry water and nutrients up and down the plant. So the xylem is going to be what carries water up from the stem of the plant. So the xylem is the up tissue. This is going to go from root to the stem. And the phloem is tissue that actually goes both ways. It can carry water and, sap really. The sugar that's produced here in the leaf can be carried down to the rest of the plant. But also, if there are sections of the plant that are above this particular leaf, some of that sugar can be carried up to those sections of the plant to feed them as well. So phloem and xylem, that's kind of the transport system. And then one other feature that you see here are the guard cells, which are the cells that will swell up to close this stoma. Or sorry, they swell up to open the stoma, and then they actually, when they lose water, the stoma closes. If you look at them from underneath, they kind of look like this, like they're bean-shaped. So this is what the guard cells look like. And when they plump up, it's like they're attached here and here, so that when they plump up, it opens this space in between them. And then, so this is where they have high turgor pressure. But when they lose water, they kind of come back together as they shrivel. This would be low turgor pressure. Now, looking at this, what's important to note is that all of the raw materials for photosynthesis can be brought together in this structure, right? These stoma will bring in CO2. They can also, so this is CO2 in, water vapor can come in and out. So if there's too much water within this leaf, the pressure can be released by releasing extra water vapor in and out. Light comes in through the top, right? So we've got our light, we've got our water, and then the chlorophyll that we need is all in these cells throughout here, right? So that chlorophyll is there to absorb the light and convert it. Don't forget also, our xylem can bring water in. So again, all the raw materials for photosynthesis are brought into this organ, which is completely adapted to handle it. Finally, let's take a few minutes and talk about a chloroplast, because this is the structure that's going to actually carry out photosynthesis. Notice the leaf itself. So if we take a leaf and, again, we're cutting into the leaf here, taking this little section out and magnifying it. Notice the majority of the leaf, if you just open up and look at one cell, the majority of the leaf cell is actually clear. Leaf cells are actually clear. It's the little tiny chloroplasts inside of here that you see, those are what's green. And that's because if you look at the chloroplast, so here's an electron micrograph of the chloroplast. Here's what that looks like drawn. There are these little tiny pancake structures inside. And those are membranous discs, and the chlorophyll molecules are actually embedded on those membranous discs within the chloroplast. Other accessory pigments are there too. The stacks of these discs, oh, and by the way, these little membranous discs are called thylakoids. Stacks of thylakoids are called grana. So this is grana, right? One of them, singular, is called a granum, okay? And then notice also there are two additional membranes to a chloroplast. So there is an outer chloroplast membrane as well as an inner chloroplast membrane. And it's important when we start talking about photosynthesis and we start looking at where the reactions take place, that you remember what's a thylakoid, what's a granum, and so on. Also, there is stroma. I forgot to mention that. Stroma is basically a fluid that surrounds all of these thylakoids, all of the grana. It contains a bunch of enzymes that are going to be required for for the parts of photosynthesis that occur there. So some of the reactions of photosynthesis are going to take place on this membrane, and then some of the reactions are going to take place in the stroma. So it's really the thylakoid is really important to remember, and so is the stroma. So that gives you some background, hopefully, and then the next video we will investigate the actual process of photosynthesis.